Welcome to Sociology 102, Police Violence, Black Lives Matter in the COVID-19 Pandemic. I'm your instructor, Professor Weary. And today we have joining us Dr. Sierra-Arévalo from the University of Texas at Austin. And one of the things that I'm really pleased about today is that this is someone I've known for a while, so you'll have to forgive me if we are a little informal and revert to our first names, Fred and Michael. This is what happens when you when you know people for a while. And so, Michael, it's so great to have you here with us. One of the things I really want to dig into is the work you've done with police, because one of the things that we do as geologists is we show up to people and look at them in their habitats. We look at them in their workplaces. We don't care what that workplace is. We don't care if you don't have a workplace or you're hanging out at the corner or you're unhoused. We'll go wherever you are and we will observe your behaviors and we'll ask, what in the world were you thinking when you did that? And so you were able to do this in your study of policing. So tell us a little bit about what you did and where you did it.
Those are great questions, and thanks for having me, Fred. This is really great. I'm happy to get some space to talk about the work in this particular moment. You don't really foresee these moments happening, and so I'm glad to have a little bit of perspective on these issues. So, how did we get into the field? I think is a really reasonable question, particularly in the context of police. I think that's one of the big barriers to doing ethnographic work with police is that there's not a real good roadmap to how you'd go about starting it. And as with most things, it all seems very clear now. It wasn't clear at the time. So I began doing gang violence reduction work with something called Project Longevity, which it's called Focused Deterrence. This dates back to the 90s in Boston. But that was begun in New Haven in 2012. And I originally went to graduate school to study gangs. That was my plan. And so I got involved with that work. And it was in the context of that work that I first met police officers in a non-enforcement context. I'd been stopped before, I had been ticketed, I'd had some not so positive interactions with them. And then suddenly I was in a professional environment with them. And I was struck by their mundanity. Don't get me wrong, they skewed conservative. They were 95% white. A lot of them spent a lot of time on the bench press and doing bicep curl. And like that was, in some cases, a very stereotypical image. And it was right, it was spot on. But then they talked about these really mundane things. Their kids and their families, and they didn't get enough overtime, or they wanted to buy a boat or the Pats or whatever else. And I was struck by how mundane they were. But they also had guns on their hips, and they had the legal right to take away people's liberty and their life. But that wasn't my focus yet. So fast forward 2 years, Michael Brown is shot and killed in Ferguson. And by this point, by happenstance, I have made connections with departments across the country doing this kind of gang violence reduction work, doing social network analysis. And I, like many people, sort of realized that the data on policing was bad, just really bad data. And I began reading, as any good graduate student should do, and I found all the best ethnographies, all the best on-the-ground information was from the 1960s and the 1970s. Presumably, policing had changed in the past half century. And so that's kind of when I made the choice. And because I had those connections to departments, I was able to leverage personal relationships to figure out how I would go about doing one ride along and then two ride alongs. And then when someone said, well, you've been here like 6 times. I said, absolutely, I've been here 6 times. Like, maybe we should get you like a permanent form. That's a great idea. Maybe we should do a permanent form. And once the first department I had access to, getting access to the second was easier. Getting access to the third was easier. In one case, I even had a request for a letter of recommendation from a third department, as in a not so informal vetting of who I was and what I was doing. But that's how I got in the field. And to briefly summarize what I did, I just kind of made myself a nuisance for a while. I was in a police car as often as I could. I rode for full shifts. I didn't do things like just go into the police department and interview somebody and leave. It was get into a police car for full shifts whenever possible, follow officers on their lunch breaks, to calls, wherever I could get into, the evidence room, or the evidence facility, not the evidence room, so to speak, the training facility. I went to an award ceremony. I went to a funeral. Anything that I could get to or find access to, or that I was invited to, I made it a point to be there. And the goal was to break through what is a very real phenomenon, which is the sort of pulling back.
Yeah.
You can't hold that facade for 1,000 hours. It's just not possible, and you can't do it across several hundred people. And so the idea was, if I'm just there long enough, I'll begin to see the actual inner workings of this organization, this occupation.
And as you were seeing those inner workings, one of the things that you started talking about was something that you termed the danger imperative. So tell me about, what is the danger imperative?
So the danger imperative is an example of something that cultural sociologists call a cultural frame. And to summarize that briefly, it's a filter. It's a set of glasses, so to speak, that we have on, and we can have multiple frames. This is born out of some of the work of Irving Goffman. So learning to interpret the world around us in different ways, depending on our context. And so the danger imperative is a very particular frame, which I define as this preoccupation with violence and the need to ensure officer safety at all times. And that frame arose out of something that I noticed when I began writing with police. I initially went into the field asking questions about suicide, because I found the statistics that more officers kill themselves every year than are shot in the line of duty. But all this conversation was happening around the war on cops. And so that was a question. So how do you reconcile these two things? We're not talking about police suicide, but we're talking a lot about violence. But as I was asking those questions and just observing, officer safety was this word that just kept getting used all the time to justify any number of things. This taken for granted thing that for a sociologist is a big red flag, right? This thing that people just keep saying, but nobody can quite define it in the same way, but everyone seems to be using it. Yeah. That is something that's very interesting to an outsider who is not familiar with that world, to understand that taken for grantedness of this thing. So the danger imperative was something that I realized, or that I came up with. I operationalized this thing as a way of beginning to make sense of how officers can look at any situation, and they're able to understand that and interact with those contexts as one in which they need to stay safe, no matter what it is. Eating lunch, bagging evidence, doing a traffic stop, any of those things could be potentially very dangerous. And so the frame allows us to understand how everything gets filtered through that.
Yes, yes. I remember reading this in the journal Criminology. And what was so striking is this difference between, for the regular cop anywhere in the country, how dangerous the job is, even when the danger levels are going down, and how that perception is sort of so strongly there. So can you tell us a little bit about, you talked about going to a funeral, and there are other rituals that you witnessed, but can you tell us a little bit about the importance of rituals for structuring how police officers sort of interpreted their lives and interpreted the dangers in their occupational lives?
Yeah. So I'm very influenced by the work of, I guess, one of the real old school policing scholars. His name is Peter Manning. He was at Northeastern University for quite some time. I think he retired recently. But he wrote the original book on police work as drama. And so he was really interested in understanding how police manage public perception. Again, very Goffmanian in that regard. They see themselves one way, they're managing the perception of the public, in particular to make the public believe that they're very good at, say, fighting crime and reducing violence. So how do you do that? And he talks about a funeral. It's not a big part of the book, but he says that the police environment is awash in symbols. And when I entered the police department, that became very clear, very fast. It's on its face militaristic. The insignias, the uniforms, the firearms, these are all things that are saturated in meaning. But then there are things that are not official. So while you might have the memorial wall as a symbol, and every single year there will be, in my Western field site, There will be a gathering at that wall. There will be speeches made, flowers laid. There will be a tour of the grave sites of various officers who are buried around town. They'll finish at the cemetery. But then you have things like wristbands that are just bought by officers themselves. You'll have tattoos. You will have T-shirts. You will have funeral pamphlets that are saved. And these are not things that are explicitly socialized within the context of the department. No one in the academy class that you go to when you're first beginning says, you will get tattoos of dead officers, or you will have these bracelets, or you will save these sweatshirts. These things are something which officers, they marinate in this. It's simply around them at all times. And within a total institution like the police department, as Goffman again would describe this, you are taken away from the rest of society in many cases for a prolonged period of time. It's this work environment. It's very insular. These processes, these rituals, again, are taken for granted. They are assumed to be the norm, and they are assumed to be very valuable. And they are very valuable insofar as they reforge the bonds between officers that Manning and others have talked about, Durkheim in particular, as sort of ripping apart the social fabric when you lose someone close to you. This is a way for people within the police department to reforge those things.
And then it had to be there had to be some moments though that were particularly difficult to deal with. So talk to us about sort of some of those moments when you're in the site. No course can prepare you for the things that you have to deal with when you're in these field sites. So talk us through some of that.
There were definitely some tough moments. I think the ones that stand out most clearly are when I would talk with officers about, the shootings of, in the case of Tamir Rice, a boy. That's the one I remember those conversations vividly, because in my mind, and this is also supported by the opinions of police tactics experts, and some officers, as I did, found the shooting to be egregious. It was poor planning on the part of the officer. They also knew about the officer having been fired from a previous department for having poor self-control. It was explicitly written in his personnel file. He was hired anyways by the Cleveland police. And so they knew those things. And they said, that's a bad shoot. I would never have gotten that close. Why would you get that close, et cetera. But then other officers were much more charitable with the officers involved. And they would justify not only in that, well, I wasn't there. That's the most mundane justifications, is I don't really know what they saw. We can't say, and you'll recognize this language anytime a shooting happens. This is actually based in the law. Graham v. Connor sets out that it's the reasonable officer in their perception. And so legally speaking, that is actually the standard, is that you have to take the perception of the officer in that context, in that moment, and what they knew. But then there were other things like, where were the parents? Shouldn't they have taught him not to be doing things like playing with a toy gun in a park? And those were moments where, as a social scientist, my job is not to convince you that what you believe is problematic in a variety of ways. And my job is not even really to necessarily argue with you. There were moments where I couldn't help myself. And you begin to prod, and those can be analytically useful when you begin to poke at people's assumptions or people's rationales for various things. But it was recognizing that this officer, or these handful of officers that held these views, this is the tip of the iceberg, and that there are lots of officers walking around who believe these kinds of things, and reconciling that with the, what I think is sort of the responsibility of a good ethnographer to practice analytic empathy, is to understand why.
Yeah.
It can be hard. It can be hard to reconcile those two things when you hear these things that you just fundamentally disagree with, that you find that roil your stomach.
Yeah.
So that was one that happened on multiple occasions with different shootings or different instances in the field. And I think the other one was a very personal thing. I was in the field on the night of the Dallas shootings, which was the single deadliest day for law enforcement since 9/11. And so the night begins normally enough, and I'm going into a midnight shift. So that runs from, I think that one's something like 9 p.m. to 9 p.m. to 7 a.m. And that's when Twitter begins posting things. Fast forward to the end of the night, I'm getting updates all night on my phone. Officers are using a group me to talk to each other. Somebody in a gas station mentions it to us as I'm going in with the officer, and they're coming out. And so it's in the air. And so by the time I get home at 7:30, 8 o'clock the next morning, I walk into this room that I'm renting in a house, and the scope of the problems that I was trying to study became very obvious. Just a few weeks prior, Philando Castile was shot and killed. Before that, Alton Sterling. Now 5 officers were dead. And I was there, I was 26, in this room alone. And you're alone. You are really, really alone as a field worker many times. There's nobody that you can really call to make sense of what you're seeing or trying to reconcile this feeling that I believe that what I was doing was important and I was deeply attached to the work, but I felt very small in those moments. Like, why am I bothering being here, spending all of these hours, all this time away from my family and my friends to study this thing? And clearly it's not getting better. And so those were the kinds of, again, you said that class can't prepare you. And it's very true. You can study all the greats. You can take any number of methods courses. You can have great advisors, as I was very lucky to have, who can try and guide, but there will come a point where you will be faced with these sorts of tensions, and there is no one that is going to drag you through them. And that's something that I think young ethnographers or young sociologists should not take lightly, and they should be aware that those moments will come in one form or another when they're in the field.
Yeah, this is one of the reasons I like to talk about the discipline as something that helps us practice discipline. Because in order to get through really difficult moments like this, the only thing that we have to hang on to is some kinds of fundamentals that we carry with us through life. But there are also some other fundamentals about how to step back and let people say what they need to say, and how to recognize that there are patterns and forces that are outside of individuals that make it a little easier to hear what they individually have to say. And so I think that's some of the benefits of disciplinary training. So this had to have been one of those very difficult moments, but one of the moments that really helped open up for you what was happening in the site. I guess the last thing that we should do is talk about the book in progress.
Okay.
Right. So this is what we do. Ethnographers, we go into the field. The next thing you know, people are asking, "Where's the book?
Where's the book? Where is the book?"
And we say, "Well, there's a title." And
there is a title.
And we have more pages if we were to sort of just throw it out there without editing. We have more pages than you would actually want to read.
Oh my God. So true. But it's one that I want to go back and reread right now, to be honest with you. So
that's all right. That's a good problem. So tell us the tentative title of the book.
The book is tentatively titled "Peril on Patrol: Danger, Death, and U.S. Policing." It's under advanced contract at Columbia University Press.
Well, we look forward to seeing it move from advanced contract to sort of book in hand. And when it does, I hope to reach back out to you and have another conversation, if not on this platform, maybe even face to face. Yes, indeed. Thanks so much, Michael, for joining.
Thanks for having me, Fred. Bye-bye.
Bye.